They called it the City of Stalin, a name meant to strike fear and pride, but by the autumn of 1942 it had become something else entirely. A graveyard made of smoke, rubble, and the bones of men who refused to turn back. The Germans called it Operation Blue, the push to cut deep into the Soviet Union and seize the Volga River. But what they found in Stalingrad was not a victory waiting to be claimed, it was a trap waiting to close. From the sky, the city looked dead, whole districts flattened by weeks of bombing. Firestorms raged through factories and apartment blocks, leaving nothing but red dust and twisted iron. Yet even among the ruins, Soviet soldiers held on. They fought from the basements of burned buildings, from sewer tunnels, from the shadows. Every room, every floor became a battlefield. The German Sixth Army pushed forward step by step, but each step bled them dry. At first, commanders believed Stalingrad would fall in a few days. They had tanks, aircraft, and numbers. But the Soviets had something else, an order signed by Joseph Stalin himself. Not one step back. There would be no retreat, no surrender. Anyone who fled was shot by his own comrades. Inside the city, civilians dug trenches beside soldiers, women carried ammunition, teenagers hauled water for snipers. The Volga behind them was their only supply line, and even that was shelled daily by German artillery. Ferries crossing at night were lit by explosions, and bodies drifted downriver by dawn. The German soldiers, hardened from victories across Europe, began to realize this place was different. Here, walls fought back, snipers hid in chimneys, grenades fell from ceilings, and machine guns erupted from what looked like piles of debris. One corporal wrote in his diary that the fighting felt less like war and more like hunting ghosts. When night came, the line between life and death blurred even further. Rats crawled over sleeping men, frozen bread was hammered into pieces, and the moans of the wounded echoed through empty buildings. Hunger and exhaustion began to bite, but orders never changed. Stalingrad had to fall. Both sides believed it was more than a city. It was a symbol of power, of will, of the world's future. For the Germans, losing here would mean the end of their advance into Russia. For the Soviets, losing would mean the collapse of their spirit. As autumn turned to winter, snow began to fall over the ruins, covering corpses and craters alike. The Volga froze along its edges, trapping broken boats in place. Smoke hung so thick that even the sun seemed afraid to rise. Soldiers called it the White Hell. By the time the temperature dropped below 30 degrees, both armies were starving, freezing, and surrounded by the dead. Stalingrad was no longer a city. It was a wound that refused to heal. And for the men trapped inside, mercy was something that had vanished with the last warmth of summer. The field hospitals of Stalingrad were not places of healing. They were warehouses of suffering. Inside half-collapsed buildings and freezing tents, the wounded lay side by side on wooden planks or directly on the ground. The smell hit first, a mix of blood, smoke, rot, and infection that clung to the air no matter how wide the doors were left open. Surgeons worked until their hands trembled, sometimes without anesthesia, sometimes without light. Candles burned low beside the tables, while snow drifted through holes in the roof. The moans of men blended with the thunder of artillery outside, and no one could tell which sound was worse. Supplies had long since run out. Bandages were torn from the dead and washed in melted snow before being wrapped around new wounds. Medical alcohol was replaced with industrial spirit scraped from fuel reserves. Doctors boiled water over small fires to sterilize knives that had already been used a dozen times that day. A bullet wound was a death sentence, a stomach wound even worse. Some men begged for morphine, but there was none left. Others begged for death instead. Nurses, many barely older than the soldiers, moved from one cot to another, whispering prayers under their breath as they tried to comfort those who would not live to see morning. Outside, trucks brought in more bodies every hour. The lucky ones were still breathing. The rest were dumped into the snow, covered with sheets of canvas, and forgotten until someone had time to dig a trench. In the early weeks, officers still kept records, names, and ranks. By November, there was no point. The wounded outnumbered the healthy 10-1. Men with missing fingers were sent back to the front because they could still pull a trigger. Men with fevers were told to dig trenches to stay warm. A few days later, they returned to the hospital again, only colder, only weaker. Among them, a young German medic named Kurt recorded in his diary that he had stopped trying to remember faces. Every man looked the same in the candlelight, pale, shaking, eyes wide with fear. He wrote that he no longer felt anything when someone died, only relief that there was one less body to care for. On the Soviet side, it was no better. In underground bunkers beneath factories, wounded Red Army soldiers lay packed so tightly they could barely move. Rats ran over them at night, and men were too weak to fight them off. Doctors tore open ammunition boxes to use as makeshift beds. The city outside might have been a battlefield, but the hospitals were battlefields of another kind, where the enemy was infection, cold, and despair. No side could claim mercy, no side had medicine, only willpower and faith that the pain meant something. By the time December arrived, even that faith began to fade. The endless wounded kept coming, and for many, the only treatment left was a blanket, a prayer, and the hope that death would come quickly. When the cold arrived, it did not come as snow at first, but as silence. The guns slowed, the wind grew sharp, and breath began to hang in the air like smoke from invisible fires. By mid-November of 1942, Stalingrad was already a frozen tomb. The Volga River, once a lifeline for the Soviet defenders, stiffened into sheets of ice that cracked like glass under the weight of trucks carrying the wounded. Soldiers watched the water turn white and realized what it meant. There would be no escape. The cold was the new enemy, and it showed no mercy. The temperature dropped below 30 degrees, sometimes lower. Oil in rifles turned to jelly. Metal parts froze to bare skin. Men who tried to fire their weapons found that the bolts had welded shut from frost. The only warmth came from the bodies of other soldiers, huddled together in trenches that had turned into icy graves. In the ruins of the factories, soldiers burned anything they could find to stay alive. Furniture, door frames, even books were fed into makeshift stoves. The smoke filled the air, black and heavy, but no one cared. For the German troops of the 6th Army, winter was something they had not been prepared for. Their summer uniforms were thin, their boots worn through. They wrapped their feet in rags, tore up curtains for scarves, and prayed that the snow would end. It did not. Frostbite began to claim fingers and toes long before the Soviets did. A man could fall asleep for a moment and never wake again. They found the bodies of comrades sitting upright, eyes open, frozen in the positions they had died. One medic wrote that the snow was cleaner than bandages, so they used it to cover wounds. On the Soviet side, the defenders suffered too, but they knew the cold better. They wore layers of felt and wool, scavenged from villages along the Volga. They rubbed grease into their faces to keep the skin from cracking. Still, even for them, survival was not certain. Food froze solid before it could be eaten. Bread had to be hacked apart with a bayonet. Canteens turned to blocks of ice. When soldiers slept, they slept in shifts, because if they all closed their eyes at once, no one would wake to relight the fire. The The cold turned the city into something unrecognizable. The dead did not decay. They stood like statues, half buried in snow. Horses froze where they fell, their bodies later carved apart by starving men who risked sniper fire just to scrape meat from bone. The sound of war changed too. Explosions were muffled by the snow, and footsteps became whispers. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. By December, the cold ruled Stalingrad completely. It was no longer the bombs or bullets that decided who lived or died. It was the frost that crept into lungs and hearts alike, turning men into shadows before they even knew they were gone. By the middle of November 1942, the German Sixth Army still believed it could take Stalingrad. The city was broken, but not beaten. Soviet resistance clung to every block, every basement, refusing to die. The Germans thought they had the Red Army surrounded, but in truth, they were the ones standing inside the trap. Far to the north and south, Soviet forces were gathering in silence, hidden behind snowdrifts and fog. They called it Operation Uranus, a counterattack meant to crush the invaders once and for all. It began at dawn on November 19th, when the thunder of artillery shook the steppe like an earthquake. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers surged forward, not toward the ruins of the city, but around it, striking the weaker flanks held by Romanian and Italian units guarding the German supply lines. Within days, the outer defences collapsed. German commanders realized too late what was happening. By November 23rd, Soviet troops, advancing from the north and south, met near the town of Kalak, sealing the ring around Stalingrad. 300,000 men were trapped inside. The encirclement was complete. At first, the German High Command told the soldiers to hold their ground. Hermann Goering promised the Luftwaffe would supply them by air, boasting that his planes could deliver hundreds of tons of food and fuel each day. It was a lie. The airfields were too far, the weather too brutal, the Soviet guns too close. Of the 700 tons the army needed daily, they received barely 100, sometimes less. Soon there was nothing to eat but frozen bread, horse meat, and whatever could be scraped from the bottom of empty cans. The once proud army began to starve. Inside the pocket, hospitals overflowed, trucks broke down, and the wounded froze in their stretchers. Soldiers burned fuel intended for tanks just to keep warm. Snow became water. Water became ice again. And thirst tormented men surrounded by snow they dared not eat. The Soviets outside the ring watched and waited, tightening their grip. They shelled the trapped army day and night, the explosions echoing off the frozen ruins like distant thunder. German radio operators sent desperate messages to Berlin, begging for permission to break out, but Hitler refused. He ordered them to stand fast, to hold Stalingrad at any cost. The men obeyed, because there was nothing else they could do. In the cellars and bunkers, officers unfolded maps that no longer mattered. The front lines had vanished, replaced by a circle of fire and steel. Even those who tried to escape found only death on the snow-covered steppe. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "The sky is our only road, and even that is closed." By December, the encirclement had turned from a military maneuver into a death sentence. The Sixth Army, once the strongest in Europe, was now a frozen island surrounded by an ocean of enemies. No reinforcements would come. No rescue would break the ice. Stalingrad had become their prison, and the winter their executioner. There was no written command, no speech, no officer giving orders. Yet everyone in the ruins of Stalingrad understood what had to be done. By December of 1942, the hospitals had become death chambers, filled with the smell of gangrene and kerosene. Every cot, every corner, was crowded with men too weak to stand. They shivered beneath torn blankets, coughing, whispering, or simply staring at the ceiling with empty eyes. Nurses and medics moved through them like ghosts, their faces hollowed by hunger. There was no more medicine, no more food, and barely any heat. The wounded, who could not move, blocked the floor space where others might rest. Space itself became a form of life. When the fires in the stoves went out, frost began to bloom on the walls. Men could see their breath rise and fade in the darkness. That was when the unspoken order began to take shape. At first, it was done quietly. A man who stopped breathing was dragged outside to make room. Then it happened to those who were still alive but slipping away. 2 soldiers would lift the stretcher, carry it to the doorway, and leave it just beyond the threshold. Outside, the wind howled across the snow. Within minutes, frost covered the faces of the men lying there. No one said anything. They returned inside, sat by the stove, and stared at the flames that barely flickered. It was not cruelty that drove them, but desperation. Warmth meant survival, and everybody gave off a little heat while it still lived. In that frozen world, even kindness could kill. A few men protested, shouting that it was murder, that no soldier should treat his comrades that way. But their words fell silent under the weight of exhaustion. One German medic named Fritz recorded in his diary that he had stopped feeling horror. "I tell myself they are already gone," he wrote. "It makes it easier." On the Soviet side of the lines, it was no different. In cellars filled with wounded defenders, men begged to be shot rather than left to freeze. Some officers obeyed, others turned away. The rules of war no longer existed. The only rule left was survival. The dead were stripped of boots and coats, anything that could keep another man alive one more night. The living learn not to look too closely at faces, because anyone breathing today might be gone by morning. When the snow piled high against the walls, it buried the truth with it. The order no one spoke aloud became a habit, a rhythm, part of the daily struggle to exist. Outside the hospitals, frozen bodies lined the streets, stacked like logs to block the wind. The cold took them gently, silently, without judgment. Inside, those who remained whispered prayers they no longer believed in. The line between mercy and murder had vanished, swallowed by the endless night of Stalingrad. The yard behind the ruined hospital was quiet, almost peaceful. Snow had covered everything in a pale sheet that glowed faintly under the grey sky. But beneath that thin layer of calm lay hundreds of bodies, frozen stiff, their faces locked in the expressions they had worn at the moment of death. Some looked as if they were sleeping, others as if they had seen something terrible in their final seconds. This was the frozen yard, the place where the wounded were carried when there was no more room inside. The men who brought them there did not speak. They simply lifted, dragged, and laid them down, one after another, until the rows reached the wall. By December of 1942, this had become routine. Every morning, soldiers cleared the corridors, moving out the bodies that had stiffened overnight. It was easier in the cold. The corpses were rigid, easier to carry, and the smell no longer filled the air. The frost was a cleaner of sins, but sometimes the men placed there were still breathing. Their breath came in faint clouds, small and quick, fading as the cold tightened its grip. No one dared look too closely. Once a medic saw the frost form on a man's eyelashes as he whispered for his mother. By the time she turned away, the whisper had stopped. The snow hid everything after that. The frozen yard became more than a dumping ground. It was a shield. The walls of bodies helped block the wind that cut through the shattered windows. Some soldiers joked bitterly that the dead were still serving their comrades. Others said nothing at all. The habit of silence grew stronger than pity. The soldiers of the 6th Army no longer felt fear or disgust, only numbness. Even the Soviets who later found the place after the battle could not believe what they saw. They wrote in their reports that the yard was stacked chest high with frozen soldiers, their boots stripped, their fingers black with frostbite. The snow had turned pink where the sun touched it. Inside the hospital, the survivors pretended not to hear the sounds from outside when the wind rose. The cold made the corpses creak as if they were shifting in their sleep. The sound followed the living in their dreams. At night, a few men swore they saw movement beyond the windows, a flicker of frost-white faces watching them from the dark. In truth, it was only the snow falling again, layer upon layer, erasing the lines between the living and the dead. When the Soviets finally broke into the city in early February of 1943, they found the yard untouched. It stood as a monument to what hunger and cold could make men do. The snow had preserved everything, every face, every folded hand, every unspoken apology. The frozen yard was no longer just a place of death. It was the final testimony of an army that had lost not only a battle, but its very sense of what it meant to be human. By the time January of 1943 arrived, hunger had eaten through every thought inside Stalingrad. The men of the Sixth Army no longer spoke of home or victory. They spoke only of food. Their cheeks had sunk, their eyes hollowed, their lips cracked until they bled. The daily ration had fallen to a few crumbs of bread made from sawdust and flour. Some boiled strips of leather torn from belts and boots, chewing until their jaws ached. Others scraped frozen fat from empty cans, dividing it among 5 or 6 men like treasure. The bodies of horses, once used to haul artillery, were carved apart until nothing remained but bones. Even those bones were later crushed to make broth that tasted of smoke and dust. Starvation changed everything. It stripped away the rank, the discipline, even the fear of dying. Men no longer cared about the enemy or the war beyond the ruins. All they wanted was warmth and something to swallow. In the bunkers, soldiers sat in circles staring at the floor, their thoughts fading in and out like weak radio signals. Some began to see things that were not there. One man swore he smelled bread baking, though no one had seen an oven in weeks. Another said he saw his wife standing by the door, smiling, her dress bright against the snow. When he reached out, she vanished, and he broke down laughing until he coughed up blood. Delirium became as common as frostbite. Doctors could do nothing. Their hands shook from weakness, and their pockets were empty of medicine. The dying muttered prayers, songs, and nonsense, words that made no sense to anyone else. The snow outside was littered with shells and bones, but no one had the strength to bury the dead. The cold preserved them as reminders of what waited for everyone still breathing. Some soldiers risked being shot just to crawl into the kitchens, where they scraped the last black crusts from burned pots. Others traded what little they owned, a lighter, a button, a scrap of paper, for a spoonful of soup. One diary found after the war recorded that a soldier dreamed of apples every night, red and heavy, falling from trees. He wrote that when he woke, his tongue was frozen to the metal cup beside him. The hunger did more than weaken bodies. It broke the mind. Men began to argue over illusions, fighting over food that did not exist. Some refused to sleep, fearing their rations would be stolen. Others slept and never woke. Outside, the Soviet encirclement tightened. Shells rained down, shaking loose the frost from the ceilings. Still, the hunger was louder than the war. It hollowed the men until they became shadows of themselves, moving only because the body refused to stop. Between hunger and delirium, survival was no longer a choice. It was an instinct, blind and desperate, the last flicker of life in a city that had forgotten what living meant. By January of 1943, the war inside Stalingrad had already been decided, but the soldiers trapped within refused to admit it. Hitler's voice still reached them through the static of the radios, promising rescue, demanding that they hold the line. Yet every man knew in his heart that no rescue would come. The airfields were gone, the sky belonged to the Soviets, and the snow-covered ruins that once marked their advance had become their prison. The Sixth Army was dying one frozen breath at a time. Inside the bunkers, men no longer saluted their officers. Orders were spoken softly, not shouted. The faces that once burned with pride now looked pale and sunken. Each soldier carried the same emptiness behind his eyes. Hunger had silenced their thoughts. Cold had stolen their strength. When the Soviets broadcast offers of surrender over loudspeakers, some soldiers listened, others cursed. A few simply stared at the ground. One message said, "You have no honor in dying for Hitler. Come out and live." No one dared to move, but the words lingered like smoke. The surrender had already begun, not in speeches or flags, but in hearts that could no longer believe. In the command posts, officers pretended to plan counterattacks that would never happen. Maps were marked with red circles, arrows, and names of units that no longer existed. The telephones rang, with no one on the other end. In some places, soldiers deserted their posts just to find warmth among the rubble. Others huddled together in silence, whispering about home. The wind outside carried the sound of artillery, but even that had grown distant, muffled by the snow. A young lieutenant named Karl wrote that he no longer felt part of an army, only a collection of dying men waiting for permission to stop pretending. The few remaining tanks stood frozen in the streets, their guns aimed at nothing. When fuel ran out, soldiers lit fires inside the empty shells, turning machines of war into shelters. Those who could still walk scavenged for food in the ruins, sometimes finding a dead horse or a can of frozen meat left behind. The rest lay under blankets, too weak to rise. Some prayed, others cursed God, and some simply waited. On January 10th, the Soviets launched their final assault. Artillery pounded the German lines until the city shook. Then came the infantry, advancing through the smoke. The fighting that followed was desperate, but it lacked fury. The Germans fired until their ammunition ran out, then raised their hands. One officer, his face covered in frost, told his men quietly, "We have done enough." When the shooting stopped, the silence that followed was heavier than the explosions. By the end of January, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered the southern half of the city. The northern pockets followed soon after. There was no ceremony, no speeches, only surrender in every sense of the word. For the soldiers who survived, it was not defeat that broke them, but the simple relief that the dying was finally over. When the guns finally stopped, what remained of the Sixth Army was no longer an army at all. Out of more than 300,000 men who had marched into Stalingrad, barely 90,000 were left alive. Most of them were too weak to stand, too starved to speak. The Soviets moved through the ruins collecting prisoners, their boots crunching over frozen bodies. They found men sitting upright against walls, dead with their eyes still open, and others crawling through the snow begging for water. The battle was over, but the suffering was not. The survivors were herded into open yards and cellars that had once been hospitals. Many carried scraps of paper tucked into their coats, letters they had written but never sent. Some wrote even after the surrender, their hands shaking from cold. One note found later read, "Tell my wife I fought until I could not lift my rifle. Tell my son not to hate." Another, written by a nurse, said simply, "They are all children. I cannot save them." Soviet soldiers found notebooks frozen to the ground, diaries half covered in snow. In one, a German doctor had drawn a map of his hospital with small crosses marking every cot where a man had died. At the bottom, he wrote, "No medicine, no bread, no God." The last messages from Stalingrad were not about victory or loyalty. They were confessions, written by men who no longer believed in war. A few survivors tried to speak to their captors. Some begged for mercy, others apologized for what had been done in their name. The Soviets listened in silence. They had lost hundreds of thousands of their own, and compassion was hard to find. Yet even among the victors, horror lingered. Red Army soldiers who had fought their way into the city described what they saw in simple words because there were no grand ones left. One Soviet report said, "The dead sit in rows, their faces calm, as if waiting for judgment." Another wrote, "The snow hides the shame. Among the ruins," letters continued to surface for years after the battle. They were found in cracks in the walls, in rusted ammunition boxes, in pockets of frozen uniforms. Each one told a small truth that history could not erase. They spoke of hunger, of cold, of regret. Some begged forgiveness from God, others from their families, and some from no one at all. For the men who left those words, it was as if writing was the only way to remain human. Historians later gathered those fragments, piecing together the final thoughts of a dying army. They found no talk of glory, only of sorrow. One soldier's last line captured the truth of Stalingrad better than any monument ever could. "We have seen the end of the world," he wrote, "and it was not fire or thunder, it was silence and snow." When the battle ended, Stalingrad did not breathe again. The smoke cleared, the snow melted, but the silence that followed felt heavier than the war itself. The city was a graveyard, its streets buried under rubble and ice. Of the 90,000 German soldiers taken prisoner, most would never see home again. They were marched east through the snow, their bodies weak, their boots falling apart, their eyes half closed from exhaustion. The Soviets called them ghosts. Only about 6,000 would survive captivity and return to Germany years later. Those who did spoke little of what they had seen. They returned to a homeland that barely recognized them. The uniforms were gone, the flags forgotten, and the glory they had once believed in had turned to ash. Many carried the memory of Stalingrad like a wound that never healed. In the Soviet Union, the battle was hailed as a turning point, the victory that changed the course of the war. The ruins were rebuilt, statues raised, songs written, and stories told of bravery and sacrifice. Yet even in triumph, people whispered about what it had cost. More than 1 million soldiers and civilians were dead. Entire families had vanished beneath the rubble. For decades after the war, the ground along the Volga still gave up bones each spring when the frost thawed. For the survivors, life after Stalingrad felt unreal. Some German prisoners wrote that they dreamed of snow for years, waking drenched in sweat as if still trapped in that frozen pit. Soviet veterans returned to find their homes destroyed, their loved ones gone. They too carried ghosts of their own comrades, lost in the ruins they had fought to reclaim. In both nations, the memory of Stalingrad divided hearts. To some, it was proof of strength and endurance. To others, it was a scar that reminded them how low humanity could sink. Letters written by returning prisoners were often censored, their words stripped of despair, but in private diaries, the truth remained. One man wrote that he could still smell the smoke of burning boots when he closed his eyes. Another confessed that he no longer knew what victory meant. The city itself was rebuilt, block by block, its new streets rising over the bones of the old. Yet beneath the surface, Stalingrad still slept, filled with the voices of the dead. Even decades later, old soldiers would pause when they heard the word. Their hands would tremble, their eyes would drift to the ground, as if the snow and silence of that place still called to them. Historians came, tourists came, cameras came, but the truth remained the same. Stalingrad was not just a battle, it was the place where human endurance reached its breaking point. In the end, there were no heroes, only survivors, and even they carried the silence home with them. For the men who walked out of Stalingrad, the war never truly ended. It lived on in the frost of their memories, in the nights when the wind still sounded like distant artillery, and in the haunting truth that mercy, once lost, can never be found again.